Hi everybody, my name is Rachel. Welcome to my channel. Today, me and Cam and maybe Holly, if she can make it, are going to read 1 Corinthians chapter 6 to whatever we get to. Okay.
Yay!
Yay!
Hey everyone.
Okay. Cam, would you like to start reading? And we
I
can...
sure can.
Which version do you want to read? We could read the ESV or we could read the David Bentley Hart one.
We'll do the ESV, eh?
Okay.
So we were at 1 Corinthians 6, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So do you have it up yet? Oh, you do. Perfect.
Yep.
When one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Hold on a minute. Are you sure we didn't read this one?
Oh, you know what? We might be on chapter 7. I think we did 4 to 6. Okay. This one.
Yeah, the body is not meant for sexual.
We talked about sexual immorality last time. We should move on.
Yeah, I think we're on 7. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Good memory, both of us. All
Yeah.
right, so chapter 7. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as am I, or as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision, for neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God. Now, concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. If you betrothed a woman, and if a betrothed woman marries, has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean. Brothers, the appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in the body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then, he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Wow, that's quite a long chapter.
Yeah, that's really long. There's a lot in there.
There's a lot in there.
Okay.
Some of it seems kind of contradictory.
Yeah. It says some interesting things about Paul, or he says some interesting things. Like,
I almost don't want to comment on it because it's kind of, it's just like an old school morality that I don't really care for.
Yeah, it's interesting how people will follow this as if it's as gospel truth, not like, oh, maybe we can get some things out of that, or maybe not, but it's like, no, this has to be true, so you have to make it work out. What do you think is contradictory? Or is that what you didn't want to comment on?
No, I will in a moment. I'm just setting Holly up with some headphones so she can hear.
Okay.
Hi.
Hello.
So can you hear when Rachel talks?
Mm-hmm. Can you still hear through there?
Yeah, Rachel, can you talk?
Hello.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I can't hear now. Here we go. I've got a different solution.
Why don't I just get my laptop?
Yeah.
You can do that, Holly, and I could send you a link if you want.
Nope, I can't hear. Damn. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you guys.
Okay.
Can you hear?
I can't hear.
I'll just go get my laptop. Be easier.
Okay. All right then.
I will send Holly a link. Sorry if people are watching. There are technical difficulties.
All right. Okay, I'm back. So like it like has these these sort of comments like of what they should and shouldn't do, but then it's kind of like sub clauses, but you know, if that doesn't happen, then do X, which that's not contradictory, but it is like pretty clear that he was giving guidance of all of these conditionals. But yeah,
he's not all about that sexual passion. He's like, it's better to be unmarried.
Oh yeah, he's
it's
definitely
better if you can control yourself, but if you can't, then get married.
Yeah, it's like that ascetic ideal or something. I mean, but it's it very much like makes concessions as to, you know, what people can do if they can't control themselves. Like it's better to marry than to have like uncontrollable passions, but it's better to not marry and to control your passions. I'm just gonna invite Holly.
I already did.
Oh, you already did. Oh, you're onto it. You might want to come over here and use my microphone, Holly, because otherwise you're going to get feedback.
True. Okay, we can do that.
I find it interesting where he's saying, like, what was that?
Mute your microphone.
Oh, I thought it was interesting where he's talking about how, like, if somebody is like married to an unbeliever, then, like, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. There's
what kind of like salvation message is that? It's like they're made holy by their husband or their wife. Interesting.
Another thing is that there's a footnote on betrothed woman that actually indicates that that really means virgin.
Is that like, so it doesn't mean betrothed at all? It's just any woman who's a virgin?
I don't know. Like it seems as though the Greek word underlying it is just literally virgin.
Where is that?
Verse 28. But do not. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin woman marries, she has not sinned. Well, I mean, I just like translated it as virgin instead. And there's another thing as well where the ESV, the bond servant thing, that's actually, I'm pretty sure it's like slave. You want to talk, Holly? Do you have the translation up?
Yep. So, I make sure you get feedback.
You're hearing feedback.
Yeah.
So if you
I muted my mic. It's because I can hear myself through your.
Oh damn.
It's okay. So from what perspective do you guys talk about it? Do you just talk about like what you think?
Just
about
anything, any thoughts you have on it.
it? Okay. So what's the passage?
I sent you a link.
So my friend Joe in the chat, he says, so theologically speaking, is celibacy a calling or a choice? It seems like Paul is suggesting it's more of a choice, which is pretty contrary to how it's viewed in the modern church. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it has that condition that it applies that for those who, attempt to, I mean, I don't remember where the exact verse was, but it indicated, for those who effectively could be celibate, you should be, but if you can't be, then you shouldn't. That's effectively what it says.
Yeah. In like my family, my church, they taught that if you want to get married, then like that's God's plan for you, and if you don't want to get married, that's God's plan for you. There was none of this messaging of like it's better to be celibate, and it was just understood that that was what Paul thought, but that it wasn't like it was just his opinion. It wasn't something from God.
I'm interested to see what Robert Price says about this particular chapter because he did make that note from I think 1 Corinthians 5 or something like that, where he talks about the Encretite doctrine shining through in some of the stuff. You know, when it talked about the being in judgment over the angels. Anyway, that's a bit of a
Like the
digression.
angels that have fallen.
Yeah, like you know how he was talking about how there was like the Encretite view that seemed to be coming out in the passage of our position of judgment over the angels is like
I don't see
dependent.
how this is linked to that though.
Oh, I was just more talking about it being linked in the sense that like Paul's expressing another view on sex. Effectively, that's the only way that it's linked.
Oh, okay.
But there might be something contrary to what he was saying earlier to what he's saying now.
Hmm. If nobody has any other comments, we can move on, unless there's something else you thought was interesting.
Yeah, well, I did think it was interesting that it says, like, were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For
Mhm.
he who was called in the Lord as a bond or as a slave is a free man in the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when called is a slave of Christ.
Mhm.
You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men.
But
It's
if you
kind of
are a
interesting.
slave, you'd be happy with where you are because you're not a slave, but you are a slave.
Yeah. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's quite interesting as well. How he does this thing about qualifying whether or not the statement or commandment that he's about to deliver is something that he got from the Lord or whether or not it's something he, gets from himself. Like he
Yeah, I thought that was
says,
interesting too.
now as a concession, not a command, I say this, but then like below it says, like, to the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. Um,
Mhm.
it's quite interesting. How is he getting those messages? I mean,
Yeah.
he certainly didn't learn from he didn't receive these from the Lord in any first-hand manner in the sense of the physical Jesus when he was on earth preaching his ministry.
Mhm.
And I don't think that he would say that he got it from the Lord if he received it from the other apostles or the other disciples through the Lord. So I actually think that what he's saying there is like having received this in a manner in which he thinks it's come from God. Whether or not it's a vision or whether or not it's like this kind of intuition, like, or
Yeah.
this, spiritual process by which he thinks he's getting a message from God.
Hmm. It seems like he differentiates the two. He's like, oh, this one's for me, but this one's from God. So he must have
Yeah, he
some
does.
way that he thinks he separates those,
Yeah.
Okay, I can read the next one, which is like half the length of the one that you read. Okay, let me just.
All right. So 1 Corinthians 8.
Mhm.
Are you with us, Holly?
Yeah, I was just reading over it because I missed most of it when you were reading it.
Mhm.
Yeah, this whole chapter I used to read a lot, Cam, when you and I were first dating.
Yeah, I know.
And I remember being like, "Oh, phew, Cam is holy."
Yeah. Actually, we should read over that part because
that was one of my favorite verses at the time. The unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and I remember thinking, "Oh yay, phew, Cam's holy." But then now that I think about it, I'm like, "What does that mean?"
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean you're holy?
Yeah, what does it even mean?
Yeah, exactly. It's really weird.
It doesn't seem to mean saved. Actually, that's a good point. I'm gonna go look that up because I'm pretty sure back when we were dealing with that, Holly, I went and looked up the Greek, but I don't remember what it is now.
Did I tell you that you were holy? Was I like,
Yes, you did.
"Oh,
Yeah.
God told me you were holy." We're good. We're okay. And I think, but I remember not thinking about it much beyond that. Like, what does it mean by your children being holy? And like, how do you know? How can you confirm it? How do you?
Mhm.
I don't really know what to look for, right? Like,
It's not very clear. It doesn't
no,
say, like, they're saved or
yeah, like,
yeah.
well, I don't think that it says. I don't think they're meaning that the spouse is saved, because it says later, how will you know whether or not you'll save your wife or your husband? So
So the underlying word is, like, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of it, but hagiazo, which means to make holy, consecrate, sanctify, or I make holy, treat as holy, set apart as holy, sanctify, hallow, or purify. Which doesn't really clear things up.
Right. Would it have anything to do with, like, when people went into the temple and they had to be cleaned? They had to go through the whole, like, cleansing process and sanctification before they could go into, like, the holy place.
Yeah, that's quite plausible. But then
It didn't mean that they were saved, but it meant that they could, like, approach
God.
But
in
then
some
I
manner
thought that everybody was already made like that.
because of the blood of Christ. But I mean, you wouldn't be, though, because you haven't accepted, because you're not a Christian, right? So you haven't accepted the
You haven't accepted it,
gift of
but
grace
but
from God.
but isn't there a verse about that, like, anybody can now come to God, like the curtain's been torn. You don't have to go through you don't have to be like a select person who has to go through all the rites to approach God, that like now anyone can approach God. And
That's a good point. And there's actually symbolism of that in the New Testament Gospels, when at the time of Jesus's death, the curtain in the temple is torn in two. And that curtain like represents like the division between God and men in like the temple in the Holy of Holies or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that like it symbolizes like, I mean, it didn't really happen in history, and we'll get to that when we start reading the Gospel of Mark and things like that. But
What? It didn't happen?
but it's like a symbolism of exactly what you were just saying. So that's a
Yeah.
good point.
And that the priest, there was a risk. They used to tie a rope, well, it says they tied a rope like around his ankle in case he was struck by God, because like
Oh, you just broke up for me.
he was.
Oh no!
You broke up for me, but you sound like you're back now. Oh no, maybe not.
She's like in the other room.
Yeah.
Yell, Holly, yell! Oh.
Oh,
You're back. You're back now.
I'm
I
back.
got you.
I'm back. That was God. Like,
I was praying.
Blasphemous non-Christians.
yeah. So yeah, the priest, there was a rope that they tied around his ankle, and if God didn't accept him when he went into the Holy of Holies, they'd like have to pull him out because he'd be dead.
Yeah.
So maybe it's weird. It's confusing. I don't understand why they make that differentiation between like the unsaved and the unclean and the holy and the saved.
Well, some of it had to do with like more ritual purity rites and like the cleanliness, like the laws. There were certain laws that had more to do with like not morality, but instead like purity, and they were like different concepts in the Old Testament.
Yeah, because I was thinking they didn't have that like saved, unsaved thing in the Old Testament, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So that's like
Well,
a
I
new
mean,
thing.
their conception of salvation was more oriented around the community of the Israel, like the Hebrew people, not individuals. So one of the shifts in Christianity, in contrast to like the religion it came out of, Judaism, is a switch from like communal. Like a communal aspect to individualism,
Mhm.
where salvation is oriented around the individual.
Mhm.
All right, should we move on to chapter 8?
Sure. I can read chapter 8. Let me just pull it up. All right. Now, concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, the one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. However, not all possess this knowledge, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, he will not be encouraged. If his conscience is weak to eat food offered to, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? And so, by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes your brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so that's like concerning meat offered to idols and all the sacrificial practices of the Greeks around them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember Cam in New Zealand when the government introduced halal meat? Do you remember when that happened?
It was a big deal.
It was a huge deal, and so I think immediately following that, a lot of churches, including my church, my pastors were like, "We're getting earthquakes because of halal," and
They said that at your church?
Because of halal. Hey?
They said that at your church?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my parents were like, we have to pray over all of our food because it could have been offered to idols.
Wow.
Yeah.
But it is kind of interesting because that's not really what it says here. It doesn't say like a blanket command, do not eat meat offered to idols. It's actually a bit different to that. And one thing that I thought was interesting here is this almost what they call henotheism, which is something that I think you believed in, Holly, where it's not necessarily the case that you believe that there is only one God that exists, but instead like that there's only one God that you worship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when he says, an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one. So it's almost like acknowledging that there are these other divine beings, but saying that no, those aren't really gods. Like they're not gods in the way that our God is God.
Yeah.
I was going to say it depends on what you mean by God, because I don't know. I believe that there was other divine beings like Satan, but Christians would say that Satan doesn't count as a god, I think.
Right, but the interesting thing is that for pagans, a being like Satan does count as a god. And that's the reason why the word demons in the New Testament, at least how you find it in the Gospels, is actually the same word that Greeks use for gods in general. It's like it's a word that generally, like in its most sort of stripped back translation, means something like divinities.
That's interesting.
But of course, like the Jews and the early Christians, they had their own like kind of structure of beliefs that sits on top of the conceptions of the beings that are in the divine realm. It's all like everything is subservient to this highest God. Which, interestingly, is another common feature of mystery religions, just in the same way as I mentioned earlier, how a switch toward individualism with respect to salvation is a common feature of these mystery religions that came about and existed around the time of the origin of Christianity, as well a switch toward seeing one God as being the most supreme and only being allowed to have allegiance to one God was another thing that the mystery religions had.
Yeah, because so you could only believe one. You couldn't just be like the pagans and accept everything.
That's right. Yeah, you couldn't just flit between these different local cults and worship and visit other temples and pay respect to a variety of gods, regionally, and then the the wider like cult of the empire. Instead, you had to, you know, purely see one god as being the best. You got to make a choice. It's almost like the origin of monogamy, except not.
I was wondering if you could look up in verse 6. It says, "Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist." So are they saying, like, I was wondering if you could look up, like, God and Lord? So are they saying that? Because it says there's only one God, the Father, and then Jesus is called Lord, and that's separate.
Yeah. So what verse was it again?
6.
6. Yeah, so it's going to be like kurios, and so here we are. So yeah, the word Lord there is kurios. Jesus is Jesus or whatever it is, and Christ is Christos. And then when it talks about God, it's talking about theos or theos, like, and then Father is pater, however you say it. I'm not good with Greek, by the way.
What's the word for Lord again?
Kurios.
Kurios. Interesting.
So is this chapter talking about like people who maybe call themselves Christians, but they still worship idols?
Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of.
I think it's yeah, no, it is. It's around that, but I think it's a little bit more subtle. I think it's like people who are living within a cultural environment in which there are like. So I remember being in a class with Dale Martin and him setting the scene in this way. He was talking about how they used to have these almost like communal barbecues, and the communal barbecues actually had like a religious purpose to them. So they were like, they'd be barbecuing meat. I mean, not like modern barbecue, but they would be cooking meat with one another communally, and it would be for the purpose of like their gods. And like people would partake in this meat. And so now you have this church in Corinth, which is surrounded by a whole bunch of pagans, and all of these practices are still going on. And so I think that Paul is talking to them about like how it is that you interact with this community of people who are offering food to idols. And
But
he
it seems to imply that
Sorry, you go.
Sorry.
You go.
It seems to imply that the people who are offering food to idols, like they're eating food as really offered to an idol, but it seems to imply that they still believe in God.
Well, no, I think what he's talking
because
about
he calls
is,
them like.
Yeah, you go.
Talking about putting a stumbling block to the weak. If anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will wish to eat food to idols.
So I think that he's saying here, hey, guys, it's not so bad if you eat the meat offered to idols, because you and I know they're not really real. We know they're not the most high God, so that's not really an issue. But if it's a stumbling block to somebody else seeing you partake in that activity, if it's something that precludes them from coming to Christ or understanding that Christ and God, are the most high God, then like, don't let that food make your brother stumble.
Right.
That's what I think, like, the general thrust of it is. It's like, hey, like, this practice that's going around you, it's not so bad because we know the real truth. But if it becomes a stumbling block, it's better to not partake of it so as to not let your brother stumble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do they mean by stumbling? Like the person will feel convicted about it? Or they will be tempted to? Is that what they mean? They'll be tempted to eat it? But it's not a sin for them to eat it, so why does it matter if they do? I'm confused.
But I think he means wounding their conscience. So
yeah. So I have my take on it is that okay. So somebody sees you and they're like a fellow brother. They're somebody who has been told about the gospel, and they see you partaking in the eating of food that's offered to idols. If they, being like weak and understanding, think that that means that you are like partaking in this thing that represents a real God, that's what's bad about it. Like, that's what it means for them to be like weak and understanding. Is that
okay. I was thinking like they would be tempted to that, but weak and understanding makes more sense.
Well, I think what it is like the fear here is that by them seeing you partake in this, they will think that's you acknowledging that those gods are real and worthy of worship. You know, and so that's how it could be an issue, because if you think about it, like if you're like a Christian and you're living within this culture where everybody, or like most of the people around you, are free and willing to worship multiple gods.
Yeah. You don't want to...
And they partake in these cultural practices of offering like food as sacrifices to them. You partaking in it could be seen as like you engaging with it as if it's just like real, in the same way as it is for these pagans. But you really know that it's not, so you know that you're partaking in it is just like a social convenience. But no, your brother might actually stumble on that, thinking what that represents is you really worshipping this other god. And that's why it might cause him to actually start worshipping that god too. That's what I think that it means.
That's interesting, because do you guys know if they talk about like causing your brother to stumble or something anywhere else? Because there's definitely a belief that like people should avoid alcohol or drugs or things like that for the same reason, but it's not because, you know, somebody will go worship another god. Like, it's different. It's like because they'll be tempted to sin, even though I guess they would say that worshiping another god would be a sin.
Doesn't Jesus call himself a stumbling block somewhere?
Well, there's that really famous passage that it's Paul calling Christ's crucifixion a stumbling block to the Jews.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They like their stumbling blocks.
Yeah. Meaning many different things.
Yeah, exactly.
Alrighty. Should we do 9?
Yeah. Who wants to?
I do. At this point, can I just quickly say? There's one thing that I actually quite like about this passage. I quite like the how he's contrasting knowledge with love. Like,
right.
It's almost like he's. But it kind of. I think it's the point that he makes through the whole thing, where he's like, don't be an asshole and be like, I know that this is the way to God and that's not the way to God, but take the approach of how things affect the people around you.
Right, I see.
I kind of like that. I think that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like not being pretentious or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, while at the same time, though, if you read this whole letter in context, I think Paul...
Oh yeah, I'm not advocating.
No, Holly, this is good because we actually have been doing that same thing. What you just did there, like acknowledging the parts that actually are quite nice, because there are some instances where Paul actually advocates for some quite nice moral practices, like being kind to one another. And we'll actually get to some even more significant ones, like, for example, the famous one, like the greatest commandment is love, or like,
1 Corinthians 13.
Yeah, and so we're going to get to that later on in this letter. So it's good.
Sorry, I said one more thing.
No.
That I remember in church, that whole knowledge puffs up, love builds up thing used to be used a lot if somebody became really interested in the Bible and did a lot of Bible study and started quoting scriptures. There was always somebody who'd be like, knowledge puffs up, love builds up. Like trying to like take them down a peg or two.
That's funny.
Anyway, let's move on.
All right. Holly or Cam, would you guys like to read chapter 9?
Do you want to go for it, Holly?
Sure, I can read. I can do that. Okay, Paul surrenders his rights. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Wow, this is really weird reading the Bible out loud like this. Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink, take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord in Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put it an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground of boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Blessed after preaching to others. Well, it was really long.
The first one was even longer, but that was good.
I took the easy ones.
Yeah, Rachel got the short one.
I run the show, so I get to choose.
Fair enough.
So, this is a really interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
I love it how it has this dynamic of like, here are all of these good theological reasons why it would be okay for me to like, what do you call it? Like, use your resources or, you know, be a burden to you. But I never did that. Like, and nor am I trying to because I'm so great.
Yeah.
It's
There's
like
a lot of that going on.
Like, I could take all the stuff. Like I could like be like
it's my
the
right,
person.
but you know, I'm just not going to use that right.
I could chew the grain while plowing the field, but I don't. But I really like the beginning where it's like, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus, our Lord? Yeah. And I also thought it was interesting how he says the Corinthians are his seal of my apostleship in the Lord, which I'm not exactly sure what it means, but
if to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord.
Yeah, there is this dynamic that goes back and forth in his letters where like it's clear that there were people who didn't consider him an apostle.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's in doubt. Like some people did, but not everybody.
Mm-hmm. And he had to defend that.
So here's another thing: is that verse 8 begins a form of like exegesis or like hermeneutics on the Bible, right? He is taking passages out of the Old Testament, in particular, like one of the books from the Torah, and he's using it as a means to make a point about how the like rights of apostles work within the Christian church, like the early Christian movement. Mm-hmm. And there's like no way that like when it says you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, that it's meaning like it's okay to be an apostle and eat people out of house and home. Like, it's like that's some friggin' loose exegesis or eisegesis as the those in the know would call. I mean, maybe that is what that verse originally meant, but it certainly didn't apply to like the Christian church. It's just like, hey, let's just take this thing and make it our own.
Yeah. There seems to be a lot of that going on.
Yeah. This was good. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting.
Paul seems to need this thing.
It seems to be like emotionally important to him, right? Psychologically important.
Yeah. Interesting.
So here's one thing that I find interesting as well. In verses like it happens in verse 20, it happens in verse 21, and I think that's it. But where he makes the statement that has this ability to be interpreted very liberally, and then he makes this qualification that like cuts people off in their interpretation. And it makes me wonder whether or not these are scribal insertions. So when he says, for example, to the Jews, I became as the Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. It's like these little qualifications that I wonder come about because it was too easy for these passages to be misinterpreted.
This is something I've wondered, like, in the other passage where he said, like, do you see, like, what big letters I'm using to write this or whatever? I'm wondering, like, how, those brackets were represented in the manuscripts, because, like, they don't have
Yeah.
brackets, right?
Well, I don't think that they are represented in the manuscripts. I think that they're parenthetical remarks that are like interpreted by the translators. So when people are like rendering it in English, they see that it's like this interrupting sentence that fits
like a
in before.
clause.
Like what do they call that? Like a compound? No, not compound.
A
It's like
clause?
well, it is a clause.
A
It is a
type of
clause,
clause.
but there's a particular name for when you put like a sentence inside of another sentence where like it starts, then there's a
Yeah.
sentence in the middle.
I don't
And
remember.
like we use like parentheses for it, but sometimes we use those like dashes.
Mhm.
But yeah, it does make me wonder because those are the types of things that people would write in a margin. So, because like one thing that used to happen is that when scribes were copying and reading these texts, when they were reading over it, if they found something that was like ambiguous and an interpretation of it went against some kind of orthodoxy, like what they thought was right interpretation of scripture, they would put these little almost like parenthetical remarks in the margins of the text. And what would sometimes happen, and we have like a number of extant instances of where we know that it definitely happened through textual criticism because we have existing manuscripts that have these insertions. So what would happen is that you would notice that like there would be this particular thing that gets copied into the body of the text by subsequent scribes. So a scribe would come along and they would notice this little note in the margin, and they would take that note in the margin and they would copy it into the body of the text, thinking that it was meant to be there and that maybe the scribe had just glossed over it and then had saved themselves by writing it in the margin. I mean, there's a variety of psychological reasons why it happened, but it all comes down to people effectively adding extra shit to the Gospels. And these instances might not at all be instances like that, but it is kind of weird for Paul to break up his sentence so strongly like that. Because it actually reads really well if you cut out the parentheses. But anyway. Sorry, I'm blabbing on.
Nope, it's interesting.
This is the first time I've seen him use any kind of analogy about physical sports.
Yeah, I was just reading that one. Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath. They do it to receive a perishable wreath. Oh, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air. But I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified.
Because you're fat, is that why? You get disqualified if you
Stop eating that meat.
Go to Burger King afterwards and eat too much. I don't know what he means by that.
No, he's definitely talking about something sexual because that is all he cares about.
I wonder if Paul was ripped. He's like, I disciplined my body.
Actually,
what's that? Yeah.
Sorry, my anecdotes from my church days. I had a pastor who was like actually quite ripped for his age, and he used to like that quote, and he used to be like, I do not box as though being the air, I discipline my body. And he would like pound his chest.
Oh, that's funny.
Is this kind of like a what the modern equivalent would be, like the race to win as many souls as you can. You know, like in church, there's this unspoken race between people of how many people can you save. You know, how many. It's almost like a notches on your belt thing. Like how many people have you saved this week, or how many. Maybe I went to a different church than you, Rachel.
No,
but
winning souls for Christ.
Yeah, because like he's pretty much this is how I read it anyway. He's talking about adapting himself in order to make himself what's the word?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. Like he's talking about him making himself a servant to all, and as effectively a servant to Christ, and in particular the gospel.
Well, no, you know how there's the thing that we all do where we adjust ourselves slightly to the people that we're with in order to for them to better empathize with us and us to better empathize with them, and to like make friends easier. So
yeah, that's exactly what's going on there.
Right. Like, and that's kind of what churches do now, and what where they
accommodate the culture.
They accommodate and adapt to the culture and their surroundings in order to make, for the sake of like making.
Yeah, I definitely had like this passage preached in sermons.
Yeah,
but there's like a contradiction between like that, like become like the people you're trying to reach, and also like you have to be separate from the world, and you're not supposed to be like tainted by their immorality or whatever.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and that's why those parenthetical remarks might have been inserted, because otherwise there's like so much room for people abusing that particular from verse 19 to verse 23.
Yeah, but it also is why Christianity is so fucking confusing. Like, where you're like, I'm supposed to be in the world, but I'm of the world, and
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
reach people, but not tainted by people.
Paul's whole philosophy is that kind of like almost like this but that, and Dan has pointed that out quite a few times as we've been reading, is that it's almost like I would love to see a study, because I would be willing to bet that this was a common form of thinking. It's almost like a like an opposite but opposite. Like he does this, he has this rhetorical thing, or like this philosophical thing, where he pairs these two ideas together, and like those two ideas are often contrary, but somehow like by being paired together they make sense.
What?
I'll think about it a little bit more, and I'll talk about it next week, because we've found lots of instances of it so far.
Next time we see it, then we'll point it out, and I just don't know how they make sense if they're contradictory. But
maybe he's saying that his spiritual man is saved and pure and of God, and he uses his body as a way to reach people. Like he adapts his body while keeping his, and so that's why he keeps his body under control, because like say he can become a Jew to reach the Jews, so like his physical body becomes a Jew to reach the Jews, even though his spirit's saved. But he keeps his body under control, in that he doesn't give over to that. So like once he's saved the Jew, he changes his body to become something to somebody else. Whereas like for example, if you went into a pub and you were trying to, if you were a Christian who was like, I'm going to go to the pub and I'm going to drink with some people so that I can make friends with them, and then I'm going to win them over. If you don't have discipline of your body, you might really enjoy drinking and decide to not save people, but just to sit and drink instead, which is much more fun anyway. Like, but But maybe that's what he's saying. So if
Yeah,
he
that's
would
interesting.
he would disqualify himself if he didn't have control over his body while he's being different things for different people.
Yeah, because I was wondering like why he mentions that right after. And I'm
Right. Yeah.
by the way, somebody.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, are we getting a lot of echoes? Is that me?
I'm not getting an echo.
It probably is me. Oh, it seems to have fixed
I
this.
think it's better. Yeah, I think it's better now.
So there's a footnote on verse 27 where, but I discipline my body and keep it under control. There's an alternate translation that's given that says, I pummel my body and make it a slave. I want to see how, I'm going to go see how Price translates that. Sorry.
Okay. I think what you're saying about like having his like using his body to win people, I'm just thinking of what he says before when he's talking about like the law and how I wasn't quite sure like what he meant about that or what he was saying, like he's under the law but he's not under the law. I didn't.
So he'd be saying like to those under the law I became as one under the law.
Yeah. I was just thinking there was a passage before where he was talking about like if we have to be under the law and the like if circumcision was necessary or we're free from being under the law.
Oh, are you talking about in the other chapter?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, right. Chapter 7, right?
Or I think it was a chapter before, or maybe even like another book. but I'm just thinking of like what you were saying. Like if he's saying that he like changes the way that he acts in his body so that he can win souls, then I'm thinking about his conceptions of like the body in relation to like what it means to be a Jew and what it means to live under the law and follow those rules. So I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just wondering how those things connect.
So Price's translation is like, by the way, I'm looking into this not because it's theologically interesting, but because it's just amusing. I subject my body to a severe regimen, making it my slave, so I will never find myself, having preached to others, in the end disqualified.
That's what I should do. What did he say? A severe regimen?
A severe regimen.
Paul should be my like workout buddy.
So Paul says if verses 23 to 27 came after chapter 7, they would make more sense since, quote, to exercise self-mastery was a key term in Encretite celibate spirituality, from which it derived its name.
Mm-hmm. Wasn't that a Greek thing too, like fitness? Yeah, like
the Olympics.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Should we move on to 10, or have we done our fill tonight?
I'm good to
Do we
keep
call
going.
this milk, or is this milk or meat? Are we in the meat yet?
I don't know. Why don't we do one more if you guys are okay with that?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
I'm just looking at what they're talking about.
In the chat. Is our
No. I'm just looking at what the next chapters are talking about.
Right.
So
Well,
it's talking about idolatry.
Is, cross quoting.
Oh, okay. All right, who wants to read? You guys want me to read?
Yeah, I guess that you read a short one, so you
Oh.
should read this one.
Okay. Give me one sec. When I'm sharing the screen, I have to remember that I'm sharing it. Because then I go and I'm like reading the chat and I'm like, oh, wait a second. Okay. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. What is he talking about? Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the grounds of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me. Oh, sorry, that's the next one. But it's kind of part of it. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Okay.
This is really interesting.
Yeah. There's a lot in there.
So the first thing is that like you were like, what at the beginning? So
Yeah.
that's the Exodus story, right? But once again, it's this like weird exegesis. Did Holly drop off?
Yeah. Holly.
Like recently or?
I don't know. I was reading. Mm. Yeah, it's definitely interesting because I was like,
She's trying to get back on.
oh, okay. They were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. So
that's the
yeah, that's like
the Exodus story of like
the cloud, the
parting
pillar
the
of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, and then
the
Red
eating of the
Sea,
same
yeah.
spiritual food as the manna from heaven.
Oh, right. Okay.
Then the spiritual drink is like the
water.
water and the rock.
Mm-hmm.
And the rock follows them throughout.
Oh.
And the rock was Christ. So like I was saying, it's just like this really weird exegesis, like
yeah, the rock that was Christ? Like what?
yeah.
That's so weird.
Well, you know, Christ does have water come out of him when he gets stabbed, right? Remember? On the cross.
That's
in
totally
the
what
Gospel
Paul's
of John.
talking about.
Well, I mean, I think it's the same trope probably coming back through. But yeah, then he says, like, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown. Like, so look at the consequences that came to them. Apparently, God wasn't all that pleased with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then when it talks about we must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did,
Mm-hmm.
and
23,000.
Now that's a reference to Numbers, I think. Hold on. What verse was it? Verse 8, right? Yes. Numbers 25, 1 to 18.
You gonna look it up?
Yeah. So Moab seduces Israel. So the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite woman. Has Holly made it back in yet?
Mm-mm.
Nope. And then there was a plague. But guess how many the plague was of?
How many people it killed?
According to this translation.
Mm-hmm.
The NIV.
What does it say?
It's not working?
No.
Oh. All right. Let's take I'll take my headphones off, and then we'll see whether or not we get a bad echo. Are you getting a bad echo?
I just have to talk, and then I'll see. Nope, I don't hear anything right now. Maybe it'll work.
Can you hear us, Rachel?
Yep.
Can you talk again?
Yeah. I'm getting a bit of an echo.
A bit of an echo?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to turn it down.
Can
what about now?
Hear me? I can hear a tiny bit, but it's fine. It's not like I can't, like very, very, very slight, but it's fine. So we were just talking, Holly, about, like, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we were just talking about the beginning of the chapter where he's referencing the like Exodus story about the like our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea.
Yeah.
And they all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. And then he says, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. And I'm like, what?
Is it the rock where he strikes it and then the water gushes out?
Yeah.
Like when Jesus was crucified and they strike Jesus and the water gushes out.
See, Holly knows her shit, right?
You think that's the same thing? Like,
what's it?
Because you said that's the same trope that goes throughout, and I was like, really? Like,
I think it is. I think that's why John put it in there.
Okay. I'd never heard of that connection before. Interesting.
Yeah, like I'd have to go and read a commentary of John or something like that to see it argued, but it probably is the same thing.
There's a lot of that in the Bible.
Yeah.
Because remember, the gospel authors had probably read at least some early, like, so for example, Mark, like I think like the mainstream consensus is that Mark is pretty heavily influenced by the Pauline epistles, or Pauline Christianity at least. And Mark is the first gospel, unless you're crazy. And John is our latest gospel. And while John doesn't show like very, very direct borrowings like Luke and Matthew do, he, at least according to most interpreters, they think that he is dependent on the synoptic gospels, at least Luke and Mark. And so John probably was influenced by Pauline Christianity too.
Or God set it up as a symbolic act of future events to come.
yeah. Or there's that really like implausible hypothesis that
that's one thing that I really like. What I liked about the Bible is like all of the imagery
fits together
and
like a jigsaw.
the pattern.
Yeah,
and,
it's because that's the way they wrote it.
Right. I like that.
Yeah, Christians still get
like
compelled by that today.
Yeah.
Because it is like a big puzzle. But yeah, did you notice how it says 23,000 fell?
Yeah,
guess what the number is from the translation I'm reading from Numbers?
What?
24,000. Womp womp.
Just 1,000.
Give or take 1,000.
Give or take 1,000. All right. So what else?
If 23,000 or 24,000 people died in a day, wouldn't we have some sort of like? Wouldn't we find that?
It'd be like a mass grave
of 24,000 corpses.
Yeah, it's quite a lot.
But... Yeah.
But we're still discovering stuff like that.
Somewhere in the desert, there's 24,000 people. That was. Didn't they die in like an earthquake or something like that? Like they followed
I pretty much think the whole of Numbers and Exodus are like made up myth, like bullshit.
I know, like in the story.
Oh, makes me feel sad.
Holly was so sad when I told her that Abraham probably didn't exist.
Oh yeah,
I almost cried.
Like she was like, no shit, like really sad. Like, oh, I just realized you're not in the video.
Yeah.
Here you are.
Oh, now I am. I am one of them, and so are you.
Oh my! Right arm, left arm. Okay, I can't do this.
I like Abraham.
I was thinking about that song before, and I was like, probably not like today, but I was like, probably nobody knows that song.
I know that song.
That's funny.
All the church songs.
Yeah, you do. I don't know many of them. All right. So.
Oh, I was also thinking that it's interesting. This idea that God judged the Israelites, or they had the rules, but they couldn't quite meet God's expectations or whatever. And it's the reason why they weren't able to meet his expectations is so that we know that we can't meet God's expectations. I thought it was interesting. There seemed to be referencing that, or at least that's what they taught in my church.
You mean that happened to them as an example? Yeah.
Yeah, now these things took place as examples for us, that we may not desire evil as they did. Yeah, I mean, that's slightly different, but I was just thinking about.
So it is kind of interesting, the verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer.
I read it, but I didn't notice that.
But the bit that I was emphasizing there is we must not put Christ to the test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is he referring to? Oh, is that like when they had the staff and they were like they?
Oh,
How did they put God to the test? Is that what they're saying? Is that what he's saying? Like they put God to the test and you shouldn't do that? Or like Christ is represented, like are they talking about that snake thing? And Christ is represented by that?
Yeah, it probably does associate with one of the stories from Exodus or Numbers.
Oh, the serpents were.
You know, like
yeah,
they got
were
a
destroyed in the
disease.
desert by the serpents, and they put up the.
Was it like they got bit by snakes, or was it like they had a disease and then they had to come and like I don't know, do something with the snake that was on the.
So it's Numbers 16. Here we are. Let's go read it because
sure.
I want to see if I can remember.
Okay.
It was they were the Israelites, and they were bitten by snakes, except for the ones that. Oh, they had to be like holding something symbolic, and the symbol was of Jesus Christ.
I thought it was like, oh, maybe we're thinking of different stories because I thought it was like there was some like disease or like a plague or something that they were struck down with, and they had to go and I don't know, like maybe like prostrate themselves or something like in front of or touch. Maybe it was touch the like the snake that was up on the pole.
Oh yes, yeah, I know the one that you're talking about.
Okay, so here we go.
We'll read,
From verse 41, Numbers 16. The next day, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron.
Oh.
You have killed the Lord's people, they said.
So wait,
but when they assembled, what's that?
Is this right after the like 23,000 thing or 24,000?
No, it's a different. It's a different. It's a different chapter.
Okay.
But when the assembly gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron and turned toward the tent of meeting, suddenly a cloud covered it, and the glory of the God appeared. Then Moses and Aaron went to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord said to Moses, "Get away from this assembly so I can put an end to them all at once." And they fell face down. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer and put incense in it, along with burning coals from the altar, and hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them. Wrath has come out from the Lord. The plague has started."
You're right, Rachel.
So Aaron did.
Sorry,
I'm reading. So Aaron did as Moses said and ran into the midst of the assembly. The plague had already started among the people, but Aaron offered the incense and made atonement for them. He stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 people died from the plague, in addition to those who had died because of Korah. Then Aaron and Moses returned. Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance of the tent, for the plague had stopped.
That's what it's referring to?
That's what it's referring to, apparently.
Okay, so that's not the thing I was thinking of, I don't think. Like,
no, I think it was what you were thinking of, because I think that the thing he was holding was like was it shaped as a serpent? Does it say what it was shaped?
Because I thought there was a story where they had to like touch the snake thing.
Yeah.
You remember that story?
I do.
Well, there is the story where like Moses has like his staff and he throws it down onto the ground and turns it into a snake.
No, not that one.
Not that one.
Okay, so
not that other bullshit story that's in.
Maybe they're two separate things, because it says we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Because in the passage that you read, they say that it says that they grumbled, but does it talk about snakes in there?
Oh yeah, okay.
So then that's like the second part. What's the first part referring to?
That's right. I'll find it for you because it has. I've got it here.
Okay. Then now we will see if we're right.
So They traveled
Oh,
from Mount
there we go.
Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom, but the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit people. Man, God's an asshole. And they bit people, and many Israelites died.
Oh my.
People came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it on top of a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live."
Oh,
So
they looked
Moses
at it.
made a
Okay.
bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then, when anyone was bitten by the snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. So this is another instance of sympathetic magic.
Yeah.
That's that thing that I talked about in one of our earlier sessions. Sympathetic magic. It comes up in the instance where there's like the reeds and the sheep and the striped animals or something.
Yeah, if you look at something, then it affects you.
Yeah, well, there's that part of it, but there's like it's almost like the likeness of certain things in parts onto it.
So
Like-
what is the likeness of the snake? Is it because the
Well,
snake
there's like a bronze snake or whatever that he
Original
built.
homeopathy.
Yeah, it's like homeopathy from the olden days.
So it was snakes biting them.
Joseph Prince. I remember Joseph Prince does a really good sermon on that, on the bronze snake.
Right.
Yeah, and how the bronze snake is symbolic of Jesus,
Mm.
and how we were being bitten
That
by
kind
the
of sounds.
wrath of God because of sin, and
Yeah,
Jesus is the homeopathic cure.
that could go in some weird
Yeah.
sexual directions, but let's continue.
Okay. The way you were reading that was reminding me of do you guys know who Frank Peretti is? Frank Peretti?
Frank
No.
who?
Frank Peretti. He's like a Christian author. Anyways, he makes these
If we turn Rachel up,
Yeah.
it'll echo more for her.
Oh, okay.
but
What
if I
about now, Rachel? Is that too bad?
no, I don't think so. Yeah, it's good. I don't really hear much. Basically, it's this author, and he's made these children's stories where he does all the voices, and he has the people like he has the story of Moses, and he has them walking through the desert, and he's like it's so hot, my mascara's running, and he has like songs. I should send them to you. It's really funny.
Yeah, that sounds
And he
good.
has like there's a song when they're praising the cow. It's like, "Oh Mighty Moo, can we serve you please? Oh Mighty Moo, we're on our knees. We're singing a song and learning to dance. Oh Mighty Moo, will you give us a chance?"
But you can tell the way that it's written that it's not real, right? Like the
What are
way
you
that
talking
it's
about,
written.
History.
The way that it's written, it's like so obviously a story.
Yeah.
Like, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread. There is no. It's like, yeah, like they all said that in
Yeah.
unison.
When the scribes they're sitting down like
It's
writing
like
down.
they all speak as a group. It's so silly.
You know, I was thinking before, like, okay, when I was a Christian, I thought I knew like theology and Christianity and the Bible like so well. Because I went through like Sunday school and I learned all this stuff. But now I'm realizing that I don't really know that much. And I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, I don't remember that. Oh, that's what that says. Oh, that's what that says in context. So this is a lot of fun.
Yeah. I find it so weird reading it as a non-Christian. I don't think that I've read the Bible since I was a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Super weird reading it as a non-Christian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you read it a lot, right?
Yeah, I read it a lot, and I read it very like emotionally, like it's very emotionally invested in the
Devotionally and-
devotionally, yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
So I'm trying to like step back and read it like objectively. But there's
Yeah.
also that pull because it's so interesting. It's I
It is.
think patterns and the stories and like the piecing it together is quite fun, and I think I get sucked into it.
Yeah, well, I
Did
don't blame you
you-
because it is interesting.
Yeah.
Mhm. Did you read it like, what is God speaking to me? Like, what is God saying to me through this passage?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, okay, I was always really bad at keeping up on devotions, and I would read like the epistles, and I don't think I was very good at that.
Well,
I was
Holly
like trying to
actually,
read it, and I was like, this doesn't make sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Holly read a lot from the Old Testament.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I had like favorite books. I did really like Paul. Well, I really liked Paul's writings, but I think I think that it's really dependent on the kind of thing that your mind is drawn to. Like I'm very into like visuals and problem solving and puzzles and stuff. And I used to wonder why other people in my church weren't so into like why they struggled to read the Bible. While they were like, oh, I was supposed to read my devotional today and I just couldn't do it, so can we pray for me?
Yeah.
And I didn't get it, but I think now, not being a Christian and realizing that religion attracts like a certain mind like more than others, or maybe why some people get into like the real spiritual side of Christianity and some people don't. Some people kind of prefer
kind of like almost bookish.
and I used to think that there was some kind of spiritual block for them or something.
That's really interesting.
But and actually in
Like I'm also thinking, yeah, like I had a deep personal relationship with Jesus, but I wasn't like, I'm just thinking, I don't know about like a while ago, but I guess once I like high school, university, like the way that I pray or prayed was very like practical, like just as if I was talking to a person, and I would hear other people pray and they would be like really like elaborate, and it would sound really nice, and I was like, wow, like that's really beautiful, but that's just not how I like how my beliefs were.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, I remember doing a personality test once when I was a Christian. I think it was the Myers-Briggs or something. Anyway, and it said that my personality type that particular personality type was really drawn to spiritual and artistic parts of life. And at the time, for me, that was like a bit of a red flag for religion. I was like, wait a minute. If like if artistic people are the ones, if religion is true, shouldn't all personality types be drawn to it? Like, why is it one kind of a certain kind of person that is able to access
The thing that you
the
thought was
thing
most
that-
important about religion.
exactly? Yeah,
That's really interesting, and I guess you thought that like everyone else believed the same way that you did,
right.
or felt the same way that you did about it.
Yeah, yeah.
All the true Christians.
All the true Christians. Yeah, all the serious ones that actually loved God and actually had
Not these heathens.
But yeah, I remember some people who would say to me that they really, really struggled to connect with God. Like, would be in like a worship service or a prayer meeting or something. They would be like, "Oh, I just don't get it. I can't access God. Like, I don't understand."
Yeah, I don't know, because I didn't have trouble with that. Like, I was fine experiencing God's presence. Like, I loved that.
Yeah.
But I didn't. I don't know. I didn't really experience that through reading the Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
So you experienced it more in church?
Yeah, like in worship. Yeah, mostly for me it was through worship and music.
Yeah.
Hmm. Or just like if I was by myself, then I'd like talk to God. And like when I was younger, I would talk to God a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
I like felt his presence, or what I interpreted as his presence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's very interesting.
Mm.
Y'all were full-on Christians.
Were you the
Yeah.
kind of Christian that didn't experience it like that, Cam?
Well, for the time that I was a Christian, I did, but it wasn't very long that I was a
I give
Christian.
Cam such a hard time because when he's like, I converted from Christianity, and I'm like,
Well, it's true though, because
your 5 minute,
yeah, because
5 minutes with God.
comparative with Holly, who was raised in it and like literally indoctrinated into it.
Yeah.
It's like my brief touch with Christ was like like somebody changing their shirt for another.
Yeah.
But I think we'll probably end the live stream now.
Bye, everyone.
Oh, we live streaming.
Yeah.
Oh.
Bye.